I want you to imagine something with me for a second. Just put yourself in this scenario. You are walking into this ancient, incredibly dense forest, like the kind of old-growth forest where the canopy overhead is so thick that it completely blocks out the sun even at midday.
Oh, yeah, the really heavy, dark woods.
Exactly, yeah.
Mm.
And the air is heavy, the ground is soft with like centuries of moss, and the silence is so absolute that it almost rings in your ears. And you stop walking. You just stand there in the quiet. And suddenly you feel it.
That undeniable sort of prickling sensation on the back of your neck.
Yes, a presence. It's this sudden, overwhelming feeling that you are being watched, or at least, that you are not alone in those woods. And for centuries, across every single continent, humanity didn't just ignore that feeling or chalk it up to a breeze. We gave it names. We called it fairies, elves, nature spirits, the hidden folk. We built entire mythologies around it.
It is a remarkably consistent human reflex, honestly. When confronted with the vast, overwhelming, and frankly terrifying forces of the natural world, our ancestors personified them. They gave them faces, names, rules of engagement. I mean, they essentially created these invisible neighbors.
Right. And normally, if we were talking about this, that's where the conversation ends, isn't it? We
Yeah.
just say, oh, what a fun bit of folklore. Or we talk about fairy tales for kids. But today, we are doing something entirely different. And I'm so excited for you to take this journey with us.
It's a fantastic topic.
It really is, because today, for this deep dive, we are opening up a genuinely fascinating, incredibly dense document dated from the year 2026.
Ah.
It is called Extension XE4, and it's just one piece of this massive, deeply intricate analytical framework known as the Prisme des Odyssees.
Which translates roughly to the Prism of Odysseys. And for those unfamiliar, the Prisma is this profound piece of architecture. It's essentially a comprehensive system designed to map human perception, memory, and, well, the stories we tell to survive.
And the mission of our deep dive today is to unpack this specific extension, which is titled Le Petit Peuple, the Little People. But here is the catch, right? We are not looking at this as a fairy tale. The Prism looks at nature spirits through this hyper-rigorous, almost clinical analytical lens.
Yeah, it's very systematic.
So we are going to explore where these myths actually come from, how they map onto the four classical elements of antiquity, and ultimately what these invisible creatures reveal about the deeply hidden architectures of our own minds.
It is a phenomenal text, it really is. But before we get into the taxonomy of gnomes and water spirits, we really need to establish the ground rules of this document, because the Prism operates on a very specific foundational axiom. The document explicitly states right at the beginning that it neither affirms nor denies the literal physical existence of fairies.
Okay, wait, stop right there. I have to push back on this immediately, because when I read that line, I literally laughed out loud. I mean, isn't that just a polite, highly academic way of dodging the question?
It sounds like it, yeah.
Right. Like, they don't want to sound crazy, but they also don't want to ruin the magic. Are they saying magic is real or not? Why not just give it to me straight?
It absolutely sounds like a dodge at first glance, I grant you that. But in the context of the Prism, it is actually the exact opposite. It's about strict intellectual hygiene.
Intellectual hygiene. What does that even mean?
Well, when we talk about the supernatural, conversations usually devolve into two camps, right? The hardcore skeptics who say it's all nonsense, and the true believers who accept everything without question. The Prism refuses both of those lazy extremes. Instead, it uses what it calls an epistemic grid.
Okay, an epistemic grid.
Yeah, it forces us to separate the data into very distinct categories so we don't muddle our thinking. It applies this exact same grid across all its investigations, whether it's looking at human consciousness, historical anomalies, or, in this case, the little people.
So how does this grid actually work in practice? Like, if someone says, hey, I saw a fairy, what does the Prism actually do with that?
It breaks the phenomenon down into four distinct levels of knowing. So first, you have what is established as a cultural phenomenon. This is the documented folklore, the stories passed down. We know for a fact these stories exist, right? That is an anthropological truth.
Right. Okay.
Second, you have valid first-person phenomenology.
Which means what exactly? Break that down for me, because that sounds like a mouthful.
It just means sincere human testimonies. If a farmer in 18th century Ireland is terrified because he truly believes he encountered a spirit, his fear is real, his experience of perceiving something is real, even if we don't know what caused it. We validate the human experience without necessarily validating the literal monster.
Okay, I follow that. That makes sense. What's the third category then?
The third category is proven fictions and hoaxes. And this is crucial for that intellectual hygiene. The prism actively filters out the noise. The perfect example of this, which is heavily intertwined with the study of fairies, or elf ecology as the text calls it, is the Cottingley fairies incident.
Oh man, I've heard of this. This was back in the early 1900s, right? With those photographs.
Exactly, 1917 in England. Two young cousins, Elsie Wright and Frances Griffiths, took photographs of themselves sitting with what looked like real tiny dancing fairies. And these photos absolutely exploded. I mean, they became a global sensation.
Yeah, it was a huge deal.
Even Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the brilliant mind who created Sherlock Holmes, was completely taken in by them. He wrote articles defending them as definitive proof of the spirit realm.
That is just wild to me.
Yeah.
Sherlock Holmes himself got duped by a hoax?
He did, because, he desperately wanted to believe, and it wasn't until decades later in the 1980s that the women finally confessed. They had literally copied illustrations of dancing girls from a popular children's book, drawn fairy wings on them, cut them out of cardboard, and propped them up with hat pins.
Oh, wow. Just cardboard and pins.
It was a complete fabrication. So the prism places things like Cottingley strictly in Category 3, which is proven fiction. We discard it from the data set of genuine anomalies.
That makes perfect sense. So you have the cultural stories, the sincere personal experiences, the proven fictions, and what's the fourth category?
The serious open questions. Once you filter out the folklore, validate the psychology, and discard the hoaxes, what is actually left over? If someone sincerely experienced something in that dark forest you described, the prism doesn't say, you're crazy, nor does it say, let's go catch a fairy. It asks, what is this human actually perceiving?
Right, like are they in an altered state of consciousness?
Exactly. Or are there specific environmental triggers? We know that certain geological areas have high electromagnetic fields or generate infrasound, which are sound waves below human hearing that can cause feelings of dread, paranoia, and even visual hallucinations in the corners of your eyes.
Wow, really?
Yeah. The grid allows us to study the human experience with absolute scientific rigor without getting bogged down in proving or disproving the supernatural.
Okay, I am fully on board with this epistemic grid. It keeps us honest. It's about, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So taking that rigorous lens, let's look at the raw data. Because when I was reading the source material for this deep dive, I had this massive realization. I was looking at the geographic map they provided, and I was absolutely floored. It's not just Europe. It's not just some Irish farmers telling tales. Why does every single culture on Earth seem to have a version of these specific little people?
It is a stunning realization when you first look at the aggregate data.
It's everywhere. I mean, you go to Celtic Ireland, you have fairies and leprechauns, but then you go all the way to Japan and you have the yokai. You go into Scandinavia, they talk about the Huldufolk, the hidden people. Down to the deep Amazon rainforest, the indigenous tribes have the Encantados. Ancient Greece had nymphs. Islamic traditions, spanning the Middle East and North Africa, have the jinn. I mean, isolated cultures that had absolutely zero contact with one another for thousands of years all generated the exact same basic concept. How is that possible? Did we all just collectively hallucinate the exact same little guys hiding under rocks?
That universality is exactly what the prism calls an established anthropological fact. It's not up for debate that these stories exist everywhere. What is fascinating and what constitutes that open question is the source of that universality. Why did human beings across drastically different landscapes, from freezing tundras to sweltering jungles, evolve the exact same descriptive language?
What does the document suggest? Because my rational brain says this has to be a shared psychological trait, right? Like we all have the same brain hardware, so we all produce the same software bugs.
That is a very strong hypothesis, and the prism explores it deeply. Are these narratives born from a shared collective imagination? Are they deep psychological projections where we map our own subconscious fears and desires onto the landscape? Or, and this is where the grid keeps us open-minded, is it the actual perception of non-ordinary entities by highly sensitive individuals who are picking up on environmental data that the rest of us naturally filter out?
Okay, this brings up something really specific in the text that I absolutely loved. The document talks about this concept of the fairy ring, or le cercle féerique, and it ties into this idea of the in-between worlds, l'entre-deux des mondes.
Ah, yes, the liminal spaces.
Yeah. When I was reading this section, trying to conceptualize what an in-between world actually feels like, I kept thinking about that highly specific feeling you get when you're waiting in a massive airport terminal at like 3 a.m. Do you know that feeling?
I absolutely do. It's a classic liminal space.
Yes. You're in this sprawling, hyper-modern building that is usually packed with thousands of rushing people. But at 3 a.m., it's completely deserted. The normal rules of reality just feel, I don't know, suspended. Time isn't working right.
Everything feels slightly off.
Exactly. The fluorescent lighting feels artificial and strange. The cleaning crew is buffing the floors in slow motion. You feel like you're existing entirely outside of normal society. If you told me a goblin was going to walk out of the Cinnabon at that exact moment, I'd probably believe you.
That is a brilliant, brilliant analogy for modern life. You have perfectly described how a liminal space affects the brain.
So how does that connect back to the forest and the fairies?
Well, the prism suggests that these nutrispirits across all these global cultures are almost exclusively associated with the liminal spaces of the natural world. They don't appear in the middle of a sunny field at high noon.
Right, they never do.
They appear at the edge of the woods at twilight. They appear in a mist settling over a bog just before dawn. They appear at the shoreline where the ocean meets the sand. These are the 3 AM airports of the natural world.
Because it's a boundary line.
Yeah.
It's neither one thing or the other. Day turning into night. Land turning into water.
Exactly. And from a neurobiological perspective, liminal spaces profoundly disrupt our standard cognitive processing. When the lighting is ambiguous, like at twilight, or when the environment's perfectly quiet, our brain's pattern recognition software doesn't just shut off, it actually goes into overdrive.
Wait, really? Why would it go into overdrive in the quiet? Shouldn't it just relax?
No, because silence and ambiguity in the wild historically meant danger. If you can't clearly see what's in the shadows, your brain starts hyperanalyzing every single pixel of visual data and every tiny rustle of leaves to ensure a predator isn't stalking you.
Oh, that makes sense.
We are desperately trying to make sense of ambiguous stimuli. We take a shadow in a weirdly shaped branch, and our brain forcefully constructs a face. It's called pareidolia. We project agency onto the unknown because it's safer to assume a shadow is an enemy than to assume it's just a shadow and get eaten.
Wow. So our brains are literally generating the spirits as a survival mechanism to keep us hyper alert in ambiguous environments.
That is the biological argument, yes. But to really understand how our ancestors categorize these experiences, we can't just look at modern neuroscience. We have to look at the incredibly complex systems they built to organize these invisible forces. And for that, the prism turns to a fascinating, highly controversial historical figure, Paracelsus.
Okay, I fell down such a rabbit hole with Paracelsus. This guy is fascinating. He was a 16th century Swiss physician, an alchemist, a theologian, and basically the ultimate cataloger of the invisible.
Yes. Born Theophrastus von Hohenheim, though he took the name Paracelsus to claim he was greater than Celsus, the revered Roman encyclopedist. He was a radical. He openly burned the classic medical textbooks of his day because he believed observation and nature were superior to ancient dogma.
Which is pretty bold for the 1500s. I mean, you don't just burn textbooks back then without making some serious enemies.
He made plenty of enemies.
But around 1530, he writes this text, the Liber de Nymphis, where he maps out all these nature spirits. But he didn't just list them randomly like a bestiary. He categorized them strictly based on the 4 Aristotelian elements, right? Earth, water, air, and fire.
Right. And it's vital to note that Paracelsus didn't invent these creatures. He wasn't writing fiction. He was systematizing what the popular traditions across Europe had already empirically mapped out over centuries. He took the chaotic, localized folklore and gave it a unified architecture.
So he just put it all into a spreadsheet, basically.
Essentially, yes. And the prism uses this 16th century taxonomy as a foundational tool to understand not just the folklore itself, but the underlying human psychology and biophysics that generated it.
Let's walk through this taxonomy then, starting with Earth, or Terre. According to Paracelsus, the Earth spirits include the gnomes, the Korrigans in Brittany, the Norse trolls, the Germanic kobolds. The lore says they live in the deep, dark, claustrophobic places. Caves, mines, the tangled roots of ancient trees, burial mounds, and almost universally, these earth entities are obsessed with hidden wealth, heavy metals, and crystals.
If we want to connect this to the bigger picture of the prism, we have to look closely at the etymology of the word gnome, which Paracelsus is credited with coining. He derived it from the Greek word gnome, which translates to knowledge or intelligence.
So not just a little guy in a red hat on your lawn.
Far from it. Specifically, the word implies the intelligence of the earth itself. Paracelsus described them as beings roughly 2 spans high who move through solid rock exactly the same way you and I move through the air. They are entirely hostile to sunlight, and they are said to hold the immense, ancient mineral memory of the planet.
Okay, I have to stop you here. The prism isn't seriously suggesting that little magical men are literally swimming through solid granite, right?
Yeah.
How does a hyper-analytical 2026 document interpret a 16th century description of rock-swimming gnomes?
It interprets it metaphorically as an archetype. In the specific language of the prism, the gnome is the archetype of the passive force.
Passive force. That sounds like an oxymoron to me.
Think about the sheer, undeniable resistance of physical matter. Think of a mountain. A mountain doesn't move because you ask it to. It doesn't care about your feelings. It is entirely passive, yet possesses immense force through its sheer mass and density.
Right. It's
Yes. Earth only yields to those who understand and respect its natural laws. The miner who understands the complex physics of load-bearing rock can tunnel through a mountain. The master mason who understands gravity and friction can build a cathedral.
I see. So if you just go hacking away at the rock with an ego, the mountain crushes you.
Precisely. The gnome represents that profound depth, that ancient resistance of the material world that you have to partner with rather than conquer. The gnome moves through rock because the gnome is the logic of the rock.
That's a wildly different way to look at a fairy tale creature. And it also brings up these other earth spirits mentioned in the text, the Lutins of Brittany and the Irish leprechauns. The sources specifically call these territorial spirits, which feels different than a gnome deep in a forgotten cave.
It is different. How did you interpret that distinction when you read it?
Well, based on the folklore, a Lutin is usually tied to a very specific human-occupied location, a specific ancient oak tree on the edge of a farm, or even the hearth of a family house. And leprechaun, famously, is this solitary little shoemaker guarding a specific local pot of gold. They feel much more entangled with human domestic life.
The prism's analysis here is incredibly sharp, and it introduces a concept we will explore deeply later on. It defines these localized domestic spirits as territorial egregores.
Territorial egregores, meaning what exactly?
Meaning they aren't just quirky, mischievous characters who occasionally sour the milk. They are the condensed symbolic relationship between a specific group of humans and a specific geographical location over many, many generations. Let's use an example. Imagine a family works a harsh piece of rocky land in Brittany for 400 years.
Okay, a long, unbroken lineage.
Right. Think about the cumulative intention required to survive there. The sheer volume of memory, the blood, sweat, and tears poured into that specific soil. The intimate knowledge of exactly when the frost comes, where the soil is sweet, or where the drainage fails. Over centuries, that intense, localized focus creates a sort of psychic atmosphere, a spirit of the place.
Wow, okay.
The Lutin is the personification of a multi-generational relationship with the local ecology.
So when a farmer in the 1800s leaves out a small bowl of milk for the Lutin on the back porch, they aren't just feeding a literal tiny man, they're essentially maintaining a ceremonial contract of respect with the history of the land itself.
Exactly. It's a ritual of ecological respect. And if you disrespect the Lutin, meaning if you overfarm the land or chop down the ancient trees or act with greed, the folklore says the Lutin curses you, your crops fail, your animals get sick.
Which is exactly what happens in reality if you abuse your local ecology. The topsoil blows away, the water gets polluted. The myth is just a perfectly packaged warning system. You've got it. It is indigenous ecological science wrapped in a narrative. Now, contrast that domestic relationship with another earth spirit mentioned in the text, the Dvergar, the Norse dwarves from the ancient Eddas.
Oh man, I love this section. Because modern pop culture, especially after Tolkien, usually pictures dwarves as just these grumpy, stocky guys with pickaxes singing drinking songs in mines. But in the original Norse mythology, the Dvergar are on an entirely different level. They are divine alchemists.
They are the ultimate craftsmen of the gods, yes.
They are the ones who forged Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. They made the magical chains that were strong enough to bind the apocalyptic wolf Fenrir. They forged the golden hair of the goddess Sif. They aren't just digging up gold and hoarding it, they are fundamentally weaponizing it. They're taking raw earth and turning it into divine technology.
Which raises an important question. What does that represent in the Prism's analytical framework? The text refers to the Dvergar as the biosoftware of matter.
Biosoftware, that's a very tech-heavy term for a Viking myth. It is, but it fits perfectly. Think about what metallurgy actually is. To take raw, useless iron ore out of the dirt, smelt it at incredibly high temperatures, fold it, quench it, and turn it into a razor-sharp steel sword, to an ancient observer, that isn't just a craft. That is literal magic.
Yeah, you're basically playing God with rocks.
Exactly. It is the transmission of highly specialized, almost secret knowledge. The Dvergar represent that software, the coded, transmittable knowledge required to turn raw, resistant material into an instrument of immense power and signal. They are the ancient metaphor for the very dawn of human engineering.
This makes so much sense. So Earth, in all its forms, gnomes, lutens, Divergar, is all about structure, resistance, territorial history, and the raw material of reality, which naturally sets us up to look at its complete opposite on the dashboard, water. If Earth is the bone of the world, water is the blood.
Precisely. And Paracelsus categorized the water spirits just as meticulously. We are talking about the Undines, the Naiades of Greek springs, the Nixies of Germanic lore, the terrifying Kelpies of the Scottish lochs, the Rusalki of Slavic mythology. They inhabit the springs, the fast-moving rivers, the deep lakes, and the falling rain.
And their primary characteristic across all these myths is fluidity. They are often incredibly beautiful, incredibly dangerous, and they can pull you under if you aren't careful.
Yes. But the prism connects this element of water to something much deeper than just the danger of drowning. It connects it to memory and adaptation.
The sources reference the broader somatic texts within the prism framework, right? They talk about how water represents continuous adjustment without breaking.
Correct. The text discusses the memory of water. And before we get into the esoteric metaphor, we should ground this in the biophysics that the prism references. Are you familiar with the concept of interfacial water or exclusion zone EZ water?
I am not. H2O, liquid, ice, and steam. That's the extent of my water physics. What is easy water?
It's fascinating research championed by bioengineers like Dr. Gerald Pollack. We usually think of water in those three phases you mentioned, but when water interacts with biological surfaces like the inside of your cells or the lining of your blood vessels, it actually forms a fourth phase. Its structure changes.
Wait, a fourth phase, like not liquid, gas, or solid.
Right. It becomes more like a liquid crystal or a gel. This is the exclusion zone. It physically excludes impurities, and more importantly, it can hold a negative electrical charge. It acts like a battery.
Wait, so the water inside my body is structurally different from the water in a glass, and it holds a charge.
Exactly. It adapts its very molecular structure based on its environment and the surfaces it touches. It is hyper-responsive. So, metaphorically in the prism, when we talk about water spirits and the element of water, we are talking about this exact principle applied to human psychology. We are talking about the transductance of emotion.
Transductance, break that down for me. Like a transducer changing energy from one form to another.
Yes. Specifically, the ability to take in an emotional impact, process it, and transform it into compassion and empathy rather than rigid anger. Think about how water moves in a stream. When it hits a massive boulder, an earth element, it doesn't try to smash the boulder out of the way.
Right, it just flows around it.
Exactly. It finds the lowest point. It maintains its essential nature while completely adapting its shape to the obstacle.
So to master the water element in yourself is to master the ability to remain fluid in a crisis.
Yes. When you are hit with a sudden, massive change in your life, a job loss, a breakup, a tragedy, if you are purely earth, you will resist it rigidly until you shatter. If you've mastered water, you adapt. You grieve, you adjust your shape to the new reality, but you continue to flow forward. You don't break.
I love that. I really do. So we have earth, which provides structure and boundaries. We have water, which provides adaptation and empathy. To complete this psychological dashboard, we need the final two elements, air and fire. The provided text stops its detailed breakdown after water, but we can extrapolate this elemental grid based on the broader principles of the prism. Let's look at air. The sources call it the stranger's gaze.
Air is the medium of breath, of circulation, and crucially, of transition and altitude.
Altitude, like getting a bird's eye view of a problem.
Exactly. When you are stuck in a fierce mental conflict, say you were having a massive fight with your partner, you are too close to the problem. The emotional heat is suffocating. You need air. You need distance.
So adopting the stranger's gaze means looking at your own life or your own argument with the detached, cool clarity of someone who has absolutely no emotional stake in it, like a stranger watching through a window.
Yes. It dissolves mental fog. Air is what allows you to say, oh, I see what's happening here. I'm not actually angry about the dishes. I'm feeling unappreciated. That realization requires the altitude of air.
And then finally, there's fire. Fire is the spark. It's the element of transformation.
In neurophysiological terms, which the prism heavily relies on, fire is the sudden activation of the sympathetic nervous system.
Okay, explain, like I'm 5, what exactly is the sympathetic nervous system?
It is your body's accelerator pedal. It's the fight or flight response. When you need to take sudden action, your brain floods your system with Catecholamines.
which are what, like adrenaline?
Adrenaline, noradrenaline, dopamine. Hormones that instantly increase your heart rate, dilate your pupils, and send blood rushing to your muscles. It is the physiological manifestation of fire. It is the sheer power of human will and the irreversibility of a decision. Think about a piece of wood. Once it is burned in a fire, it turns to ash.
Right. It can never, ever be wood again.
The transformation is absolute.
So fire is the element of irreversible action.
Exactly. It's the moment you finally quit the toxic job. It's the moment you speak the hard truth, you burn the bridge.
This is incredible. I want you, the listener, to really picture this as a dashboard for your own biology and psychology. Imagine you're sitting in the driver's seat of your car, but instead of checking your speedometer and your gas gauge, you are checking your elemental balance. Earth is your bones, your posture, your fundamental feeling of being grounded. Are you stable or are you unmoored? Water is your blood, your adaptability. Are you rigidly fighting a situation you can't change, or are you flowing around it? Air is your breath, your mental clarity. Can you zoom out and see the big picture? And fire is your metabolism, your drive. Do you have the spark, the sheer biological energy to actually execute the decision?
It is a perfect ancient diagnostic tool translated for the modern mind. And what the Prism does next is crucial, because having a diagnostic dashboard is useless if you don't know how to actually drive the car. That brings us to a foundational concept the document calls the alchemy of thoughts, or alchemy des pensées.
Right. And I have to be honest, when I hear the word alchemy, my brain immediately goes to the stereotypical image of old men in pointy hats, sitting in stone towers, desperately trying to turn lead into gold so they can get rich.
Which, to be fair, was a real historical proto-science. We have to separate the literal history of alchemy from the esoteric psychological metaphor that the Prism uses. Historical alchemy, stretching from the Hellenistic period all the way to the 17th century, gave us the foundations of modern chemistry. They invented distillation. They discovered mineral acids like nitric and sulfuric acid. They developed complex alloys.
Didn't Isaac Newton write a ton about alchemy? Like, secretly?
Isaac Newton was a deeply dedicated alchemist. He wrote vastly more words on alchemy and theology than he ever did on physics or calculus. These were brilliant people doing real physical experiments in laboratories. But parallel to that physical laboratory work, there evolved an esoteric psychological alchemy.
So instead of transmuting physical lead into physical gold, you are transmuting the inner self.
Precisely. You are transmuting the heavy, dark lead of human ignorance, fear, and trauma into the shining gold of wisdom, clarity, and aligned action.
And the Prism uses a very specific alchemical protocol as an active daily psychological tool. It's built around a famous Latin phrase, solve et coagula. Dissolve and coagulate, break it down, and build it back up better.
Let's walk through how this actually works in practice, using the elemental framework we just established.
Okay, yeah, let's use a very grounded modern example. Say you are at work, you've just received an email that your entire project is being scrapped, your budget is cut, and you are terrified you're going to be fired. You are overwhelmed. You are on the verge of a panic attack. Your mind is just looping on worst-case scenarios. How does the Prism tell us to use solve et coagula to fix this?
The Prism breaks the psychological transmutation down into 3 distinct stages. The first stage is called nigredo, the black stage. This is deeply associated with the element of earth.
Nigredo, blackening. What are we doing here?
Nigredo is the alchemical stage of putrefaction, of breaking down and dissolving the raw material. In our psychological example, this is about dissolving the frantic, limiting thoughts. Functionally, it is an act of expulsion. You are overloaded with sympathetic nervous system energy panic. You have to dump that charge.
How? Like, physically how?
By using the earth. The text describes spending just 1 minute forcing long, heavy, audible exhalations. You focus entirely on the physical sensation of gravity. You visualize the literal physical weight of your anxiety, the buzzing in your chest draining down through your legs, through your feet, and emptying into the floor beneath you. You are using the earth element to absorb the excess charge of your nervous system. You let the mountain take the hit.
Okay, I could literally feel my shoulders dropping just imagining that. So you've dumped the garbage into the earth, you've stopped the panic spiral. What's the second stage?
The second stage is albedo, the white stage. This is associated with the element of air. You've emptied the trash. Now you need to clear the room and see what's actually left.
Oh, this is the stranger's gaze we talked about.
Exactly. This is the process of stepping back, creating that vital distance, and clarifying the signal. In a state of panic, your thoughts are completely enmeshed with your identity. You think, I am a failure. My life is ruined. Albedo is the process of washing those thoughts white. You strip away the emotional narrative and simply name the objective facts.
So instead of saying I'm a failure, you say,
You say, the fact is, the project budget was cut. My heart rate is currently elevated. I have updated my resume in the past. You look at the situation with the cool, detached breeze of air.
you've created altitude. You aren't in the swamp anymore. You're looking at a map of the swamp.
Precisely. And once you've achieved that cool clarity, you move to the final stage, rubedo, the red stage, the element of fire.
So we've done earth for grounding, air for clarifying. Now we bring the heat. What does rubedo look like in our office scenario?
Rubedo is the fixing of the intention. It is the coagulation part of solve et coagula. You take that perfectly clarified neutral state and you inject it with the sudden spark of your own will to create a sovereign act. You make an irreversible decision. You decide, I will calmly email my boss to request a meeting for tomorrow morning to discuss transition steps, and then I will go for a walk. And you lock it in.
You strike the match and take the action.
Yes. And what is so profoundly fascinating here is that the prism emphasizes over and over that this is not literal magic. It is a deeply documented neurophysiological regulation technique.
Right. You mentioned vagal regulation earlier. How does this alchemical process map to the vagus nerve?
The vagus nerve is the superhighway connecting your brain to your internal organs, your heart, lungs, and gut. When you do the Nigredo stage, those long, heavy exhalations, you are mechanically stimulating the vagus nerve. This releases acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter that literally forces your heart rate to slow down. It forcibly shifts your body out of the sympathetic threat response and activates the parasympathetic rest and digest system.
So the alchemy is literally just biology in disguise.
It is. It moves you out of the emotional amygdala and up into the prefrontal cortex, where you have executive function and can actually plan your next move. But the genius of the prism is recognizing that humans are storytellers. We respond infinitely better to a grand metaphor than we do to a sterile medical instruction.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, if my therapist tells me you need to downregulate your amygdala and engage your prefrontal cortex, my eyes just glaze over. It does nothing for me. But if you tell me to drain the heavy lead of my panic into the earth, wash my mind with the white air of truth, and forge the gold of my intention with fire, that activates my imagination. It gives the invisible biological process a heroic form that I can actually hold on to in practice.
And that concept, the uniquely human ability to give a name, a form, and a narrative to invisible complex forces, brings us perfectly to the next major concept in the prism. And this is where things get truly wild. We have talked about spirits tied to nature, like the gnomes and the lutins, but what about spirits that are tied to groups of people?
Okay, yes. The egregores. The document spends a significant amount of time on this concept, and the etymology alone is a trip. The word egregore comes from the ancient Greek word egrogoroi, which translates roughly to the watchers or the awake ones.
It is a very ancient, very loaded term.
It really is. The sources trace this word all the way back to the apocryphal Book of Enoch, which was written somewhere around the 3rd century BCE. It's a Jewish apocalyptic text that didn't make it into the canonical Bible. And in that text, the egregores were literal physical angels who rebelled against God, descended to earth, and mated with human women. But crucially, they taught humanity forbidden knowledge. They taught us astronomy, meteorology, the forging of weapons, and even cosmetics.
It is a foundational human myth. It's the idea of forbidden technology or profound knowledge coming from outside the normal human sphere. It's Promethean. But the prism tracks how this word evolved over millennia, because in the 19th century, during the huge revival of European occultism, thinkers like the French esotericist Eliphas Lévy took the word egregore and changed its meaning entirely.
Right. And this is where it sounds like straight-up science fiction. In the 19th century occult view, an egregore is no longer a fallen angel from heaven. It is an autonomous, invisible psychic entity that is actually created by the collective focus, intention, and rituals of a group of humans.
Yes. The occultists believe that if a secret society, a church, or a political movement focused enough emotional energy on a specific symbol or goal, that collective psychic energy would coalesce. It would form a living, invisible spirit, an egregore.
Wait. Let me get this straight. So if a bunch of people believe in something hard enough, they create a literal, invisible monster that floats above them in the ether.
In the 19th century esoteric view, yes, absolutely. And they believed it was incredibly dangerous. Because once a group created this entity, the egregore took on a life of its own. It developed a survival instinct. And if the group's beliefs started to wane, the egregore could actually begin to manipulate the group, feeding on their emotional energy, particularly their fear or fanaticism, to sustain its own invisible existence.
That is utterly terrifying. That is psychic vampire territory. But obviously, the prism, which we've established is highly analytical and grounded in biophysics, isn't telling us to watch out for invisible psychic vampires floating in the boardroom. So how does it ground this insane concept?
The prism applies its level 3 conceptual grid here. It entirely strips away the metaphysical spookiness, the ghost stories, and the occult literalism. Instead, it uses egregore as a highly effective, incredibly precise metaphor for complex sociology. It uses it to describe collective memory, sociological cohesion, and institutional culture. It defines the egregore simply as the spirit of the core.
The spirit of the group. Okay, let's make this concrete for the listener. I want to try an analogy here. Think about a wildly toxic corporate culture. We've all either worked in one or heard horror stories. You walk into a company on day one and you immediately feel it. Everyone is miserable. Everyone is hyper-competitive. Everyone is constantly looking over their shoulder in paranoia. It's suffocating.
Probably a familiar scenario for a lot of people.
Right. Now, let's say the board of directors realizes this is bad for business. They fire the toxic CEO. They fire the worst middle managers. They bring in a completely new crop of optimistic, friendly people. But somehow, within 6 months, the new hires are just as paranoid and miserable as the old ones. The culture itself infected them. It feels like a living, breathing thing that crushes you, independent of the actual people currently in the building. That is a negative egregore.
That is a flawless example. You have just perfectly described how an egregore functions in a sociological context. The corporate culture became an emergent property. It became larger and more powerful than the sum of the individuals within it. The system developed its own immune system, its own incentives, and its own gravity.
And conversely, you can have a positive egregore, right? Think of a truly legendary sports team like the 90s Chicago Bulls, or a deeply supportive artistic community. The players or the artists might not be the absolute best in the world individually, but when they get together, they play with this almost telepathic synchronicity. They elevate each other beyond their individual stats. They've built a positive egregore. The spirit of the team is lifting them up.
Exactly. The prism argues that human sociology is entirely governed by these emergent properties. Families have egregores. Nations have massive, complex egregores. Religions have ancient egregores. And calling it an egregore, giving it a name and a face, just like our ancestors give the Luton a name and a face, gives us a massive cognitive advantage. It gives us a handle to grasp an invisible architecture. It helps you recognize when you are unconsciously feeding your energy into an egregore that is no longer serving you, or worse, one that is actively destroying you.
This entire deep dive is kind of blowing my mind right now because we are seeing a massive unified pattern. It is showing how humans have always built these incredible, intricate architectures to navigate the overwhelming unknown. Thousands of years ago, we built the taxonomy of the little people to map the terrifying, chaotic wilderness of nature. In the 19th and 20th centuries, we built the concept of egregores to map the terrifying, complex wilderness of crowds and society.
It's all the same human reflex.
Yes. But here is where we take the final plunge in this document, because the prism asks the ultimate question. What happens when the terrifying wilderness isn't outside in the woods and it isn't in the boardroom? What happens when the terrifying wilderness is inside your own head?
And this is where we enter the realm of the lexique des architectures internes, the lexicon of internal architectures. For me, this is perhaps the most profound and moving section of the entire Prismes Odyssée, because it suggests a radical shift in how we view the self. It suggests that we do not just have one simple monolithic identity.
The text actually describes the human mind as an ecology. It calls it an inner civilization. And it notes that this is especially true and especially complex for highly sensitive people or people who have had to navigate significant trauma in their lives.
Yes, think about the human organism's drive to survive. When the outside world, the social reality, the family home becomes chaotic, abrasive, or physically dangerous, the human mind doesn't just shut down and die. It builds, it adapts, it populates the internal landscape to manage the unmanageable external reality.
And the prism profiles these specific inner entities, these internal spirits, if you will, with astonishing precision. They map them just like Paracelsus mapped the gnomes and the sylphs. And I want to make it clear for the listener, the document does not treat these as psychiatric pathologies. It isn't talking about dissociative identity disorder in a clinical, pathological sense. It frames these architectures as brilliant, beautiful, adaptive functions of a single consciousness learning how to survive the fire.
That framing is essential. Let's look closely at the first one detailed in Lexicon the Witness, or Le Témoin.
The witness. The text describes this as the fundamental observer. It is a part of your mind that just watches what is happening, completely without judgment. It doesn't panic, it doesn't try to fix anything, it doesn't run away, it just notes the data. Ah, the heart is racing right now, the hands are shaking, the voice on the phone is yelling.
The witness is the absolute bedrock of any form of self-regulation. It is closely related to the element of error we discussed earlier. Without the witness, you are completely enmeshed. You are the panic. The witness gives you that microsecond of space between stimulus and response. But when a traumatic experience becomes far too overwhelming, even for the witness to just observe calmly, another architecture steps in to manage the load. The cartographer, or le cartographe.
I have to admit, I felt so seen when I read about the cartographer. I identified with this one so intensely. The text says the cartographer is the part of the mind that absolutely refuses to accept chaos. When life gets terrifyingly unpredictable, the cartographer steps in and obsessively turns chaotic experiences into maps, systems, categories, and atlases.
It is the ultimate intellectual defense mechanism. If I can categorize my pain, if I can name the exact psychological dynamic of my dysfunctional family, if I can build a spreadsheet of the chaos, then I can survive it. Because it is no longer an unknown monster, it's a data point.
Exactly. It's the belief that comprehension equals control.
And it is highly productive defense mechanism. The Prism des Odyssées itself, this incredibly elaborate document with its grids and axioms, is clearly the supreme work of a master cartographer. But as we move deeper into the lexicon, we encounter much more poignant, heartbreaking architectures, like the exile, l'enfant exilé.
The exiled child. The text describes this as the part of the mind that is endlessly searching for a habitable place to exist. It notes that for some individuals, particularly children in abusive or neglectful environments, the external social reality is so dangerous, so devoid of love or safety, that the internal world becomes their primary habitat.
They migrate inward.
Yes. The exile retreats into the imagination, into fantasy worlds, into books, into silence, because the internal landscape is literally the only place they can truly breathe without fear of being attacked.
And that precious, vulnerable exile is almost always guarded by a fierce protector, the dissociator, le dissociateur. Now, in standard clinical psychology, dissociation, the feeling of disconnecting from your body or reality, is often viewed purely as a negative symptom of severe distress. It's a problem to be fixed, but the Prism reframes it entirely functionally.
It calls the dissociator a technology of survival.
Exactly. The dissociator's job is to create distance, not to destroy the mind, not to induce madness, but to make survival possible in an impossible moment. Imagine a child going through a deeply traumatic event. The intensity of that experience vastly exceeds the child's neurological capacity to process it. If they felt the full weight of it in real time, their nervous system would fry.
It would just be too much to handle.
So the dissociator steps in, takes the controls, and says, okay, the body's going to go through this, but we are not going to be here for it. We are going to put this memory in a locked box over here, and we are going to float up near the ceiling for a while, just until the danger has passed.
It is a profound act of self-mercy by the brain.
It truly is. And finally, coordinating all of this vast internal civilization, you have the most complex architecture of all the world architect, l'architecte du monde.
This is the part of the consciousness that doesn't just hide in the internal world like the exile. The world architect actively builds. It constructs entire cosmologies, mythologies, and intricate symbolic systems to navigate reality. It writes the stories that allow the mind to process its own existence.
Like someone building a massive interconnected philosophical framework spanning multiple extensions, like the Prisme des Odyssées itself. The author of this document is a world architect mapping their own mind. And there is a line in this final section of the text that I think is one of the most profound things I've read in a long time. It says, certain internal worlds are less fictional than certain social reality.
Wow. Just let that sink in.
We often dismiss the internal world as just imagination or fake, while we treat the external social world, corporate hierarchies, the stock market, political borders as absolutely real. But the Prism argues that a deeply constructed internal ecology, the witness, the cartographer, the exile, is often vastly more authentic, more functionally true to the organism's survival than the artificial performative social games we are forced to play in the external world. These inner entities are not a fractured, broken mind. They are a wildly complex, beautiful ecology. They are different modes of a single vast consciousness learning how to inhabit multiple realms at once.
So what does this all mean? Let's bring this massive journey home for you, the listener. We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We started with Paracelsus in the 16th century, cataloging gnomes in dark caves and Jirvagar forging magical hammers. We move to the alchemical transmutation of our own nervous systems, turning panic into intention. We explored the sociology of egregores, recognizing when a corporate culture acts like an invisible vampire. And finally, we descended all the way down into the hidden civilization of our own minds, mapping the cartographer and the dissociator.
It's a huge sweep of information.
It is. But whether we are looking at a Breton Luton guarding a territorial farm, or a modern egregore draining a community, or the inner exile seeking a safe harbor, this entire deep dive is really about one core truth. It is about how human beings use symbols, stories, and archetypes to interact with vast, overwhelming forces that we cannot fully control.
That is the perfect synthesis. And that is the ultimate actionable takeaway for you listening to this right now. You don't need to believe in literal fairies dancing in the woods to use the profound technology they represent. You have access to that elemental dashboard right now, today.
Exactly.
When you feel chaotic and unmoored, you can use Earth. You can literally feel the gravity pulling down on your feet, dump your tension, and anchor yourself. When you hit a massive roadblock in life, you can use water to find a fluid adaptation, maintaining your empathy while flowing around the obstacle. When you are lost in the suffocating weeds of an emotional problem, you can use air to take a deep breath, gain altitude, and view your life with the stranger's gaze. And when you finally need to act, you can summon the fire of your intention to make an irreversible change. You are not a victim of the invisible world. You are the operator of your own internal ecology.
I love that so much. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final, slightly provocative thought to mull over on your own time. This isn't explicitly in the 2026 text we read, but it builds right off of everything we've unpacked today.
Oh, I like where this is going.
We look back at our ancestors, who sincerely believed in gnomes, sylphs, and fairies. And from our modern technological vantage point, we tend to think, oh, how quaint, how naive. They believed in invisible little entities that lived out in the ether. Entities that could do tasks for them, guard secret knowledge, and manage the overwhelming forces of nature.
Right. We can be very condescending about it.
Exactly. But I want you to look closely at us right now. Look at what we are doing in the tech world today. What are we currently building? We are building invisible, highly specialized AI agents that live entirely in the digital ether. We deploy these invisible entities to fetch information for us, to guard our personal data, to perform complex, unseen tasks in the background while we sleep.
Oh, wow. That's so true.
So here's the question I want to leave you with. Have we actually outgrown the myth of the little people, or did we just finally invent the technological infrastructure to summon them for real?
That is a brilliant and honestly slightly unsettling thought to end on. It seems the human drive to populate the invisible world with helpers remains entirely unchanged.
It really does. The forest just turned into servers. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today. It has been an absolute pleasure. Until next time, keep your elemental dashboard tuned, respect the egregore of your workplace, and maybe, just maybe, leave a little bowl of milk out for your AI agents. You never know. Take care.